So I just watched Professor Anton's video on the primacy of ontology as opposed to epistemology, and I definitely appreciate Corey's thoughts and agree with most of them. But I would say I have the tendency to lean more towards sort of reciprocal interplay between epistemology and ontology, such that it's sort of difficult to decide once and for all which comes first. I have just as much criticism for Cartesianism, which is still very much active in cognitive science, contemporary cognitive science, at least in its computationalist or representationalist forms. There is a sort of tacit assumption that the intellect is separate from nature or the external world, and the intellect can reach in and know that external world through some sort of a representational process of literally processing, information processing. And, the ontology is already assumed here, that it's Cartesian, and many of these representationalists will claim to be materialists, though because they have neglected the importance of ontology, they don't see that their materialism is really founded upon a Cartesian metaphysics of a separate mental substance over and against a material substance. And the only thing that these two have in relation to one another are representations. And, for Descartes, why are the representations accurate? Why do they actually give us a picture of the world as it exists outside of our isolated minds? Only because God has designed it so. And so this is all underlying representationalism in cognitive science today. And not only does it neglect ontology, it neglects biology. And I think really biology is so much more a philosophical science than say physics, though I think even there philosophy has much to say. But biology is especially philosophical because it's requiring us to confront ontological questions. Theories of Darwinian evolution sort of put the ontological question of ontogenesis, of individual living organization, they put that to the side, and certainly put consciousness to the side as well, in order to focus on the phylogenetic issues of how the abstraction species changes over time. Darwin's theory doesn't really account for the emergence of life or for biological individuals or consciousness, as I said. Darwin just assumes this, and given biological individuals that exist, his theory of speciation follows. But if we want to actually understand biological individuals, ontogeny, we've got to ask questions, about parts and wholes, about the many and the one. And it's probably the same question. Individual organisms have a certain wholeness, and to understand how the form of wholeness, they represent the body plan of various so-called species. In order to understand that, we've got to think of more than just parts, mechanical parts. And so, as we've discussed in earlier videos that Corey has made and that I made, formal and final causality are impossible to do without when trying to explain biological systems. So, to understand wholeness, I think we need to start doing ontology. being is what always already exists. And so, there's a tendency to think that thought erupts out of being, though it doesn't really escape it, is being reflecting upon itself. And this is giving a primacy to ontology, right? But I think the question here is one of language, also speech, primarily. You could almost say that when the human being learns to speak, the world, nature, is created again in a different way, not in the physical way that it first emerged, but in a spiritual way, where by naming the world and various aspects of experience, human beings remake the image of the world and then begin to remake themselves. I think human beings learned what we call language by singing and dancing and drumming for the numinous, enchanted natural world around them. And only secondarily did they turn and start facing each other and learning to speak languages that allowed them to share inner experiences with one another. So, first it's a performance for nature, linguistic and really musical at that point expressions. And then we begin to speak to one another and start forming common mythic narratives, epic poems that sort of give us characters to structure our lives around. And eventually we begin, somewhere in Egypt, a Semitic people invented an alphabet. There were writings before this, but never as easily learned and democratically available as the alphabet. We began to write, and now it's like we're turning away from each other again to face the page and the letter and the word. And this allows this inner experience of what really phenomenologically amounts to a cogito. Reading and writing, especially typing or reading print, these are mental representational activities. That's how they are experienced. And it's as though, as Walter Ong argues, writing completely restructures consciousness and in fact reorganizes perception such that vision begins to dominate and we get a sense of space as extension, which is just a privilege, visual sense of space, rather than, say, the auditory sense, where space is not inside or outside, but, certainly it permeates you, and so can't be said to extend out from a point which you supposedly are, separate from the world. Hearing certainly centers you, envelopes you, but doesn't allow you to experience yourself as separate in the way that sight does, in the sense of space as extended out from an unextended thinking substance. So learning to write gave us this deeper sense of interior experience, and then with electronic cultures, we have what Ong calls secondary orality, where, with radio we begin to listen to one another again, and a sort of mass group mind begins to emerge and can be supported. And then with television, vision comes back into play, but the visual mirror of other faces, and that, unlike the visual written letter on the page, is more lively and emotional and personal. And so, though we are now still literate minds speaking to one another face to face, and so writing is influencing our communicative transactions, we're also repersonalizing thought And so the cogito is becoming more of an inter-subject, an inter-being, than a private, isolated subject. So in the absence of time, I'm going to have to wrap it up. But thanks for listening, and let me know if you disagree. In reading Walter Ong, I'm learning more about how oral exchanges, such as what YouTube facilitates, are agonistic, meaning it's about dialogue, disagreement, confrontation. Communication, this word, the root is munition, as in ammunition, so it's, not necessarily peaceful. So yeah, let me know what you think, especially if you disagree. Thanks for listening.